Welcome to Energy Law with Energy Law Prof. Today we're going to talk about some of the environmental impacts of the transport sector and how we try to address those, considering both those local air pollution impacts and the impacts of transport infrastructure, but also especially how we increase vehicle efficiency so that we have to use fewer fuels. All right. So the first case that you had is this St. Paul NAACP versus the Department of Transportation. This was a case about a light rail project, so about a mass transit project. And the plaintiffs here are alleging that that light rail project is going to have a cumulative impact that is because of its impact on a community that has already been very severely impacted by previous interstate construction. So the Rondo community in St. Paul, this is actually where my grandmother grew up, was a historically African-American community that was cut in half by an interstate before we had modern environmental review, and that displaced lots of people. And then for those who remained, they were subjected to a huge amount of air pollution from that highway. So it had a devastating impact. And so the argument is, well, this light rail project will further cut up this neighborhood that's already been cut up by the interstate. Now, the Department of Transportation said, we were actually trying to consider those environmental justice impacts throughout our National Environmental Policy Act, Environmental Impact Statement, environmental review. And so we did a lot of things to try and mitigate it. We tried to maintain visual connection across those tracks. We maintained most of the pedestrian crossings, and in fact, we improved a number of them to try and improve connectivity across the neighborhood. And here you can see that the court ultimately says that the environmental impact statement did enough to address these cumulative impacts of this light rail project impacting this community that had already been so impacted by this interstate cutting it in half. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the another side of transportation, which is its efficiency. And the reason that we focus so much on just using less energy for transport is because transport is still driven largely by carbon-based fuels. Fossil fuels and biomass, that's when it's burned, also produces carbon dioxide. And you can see that here in this chart. You can see transportation is a large part, it's the single biggest component of U.S. energy use. And remember, we have 100 quadrillion BTU of energy used in the United States approximately every year. Makes for round numbers, and so you can see transportation is about 28% of that. And you can see that most of that energy is coming from petroleum, it's coming from oil. And you see a little bit of contribution from biomass, that's like the ethanol. We'll talk about that in a future class. You can see a little bit of contribution from natural gas. You may have noticed, natural gas fueled buses in cities. And then you also get a tiny, tiny bit from electricity. This is from 2019. That's been growing by year, but still a tiny part of the sector. So generally, we're burning carbon-based fuels, both biomass and fossil fuels. And so when those are burned, you're releasing carbon dioxide and energy together. So the whole point is to release the carbon dioxide so you get the energy out. And so that means that one of our big goals will be trying to reduce the energy use inputs so that we can reduce the carbon dioxide output from the sector. Okay. So as you saw, 28% of our U.S. energy is used for transportation. Where does that energy come from? Well, we see that over half of it comes from gasoline in the transport sector. So, that's for a lot of your cars, light duty vehicles, your SUVs, etc. We can see the next biggest percentage is distillates, which would be diesel. And so for a lot of that heavy trucking, you see jet fuel for airplanes. You see that 5% from biofuels, a little bit from natural gas as well. So you can see that the vast majority is those oil-based sources, gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. And that's why just the vast bulk, 25.8 out of the 28.2 quads of energy entering the transport system are just from petroleum. Okay, so That means we have a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions from this sector, a lot from passenger cars, 43%, and then light duty trucks make up another 18%. So that, those kind of passenger vehicles and smaller vehicles are, over half of the greenhouse gas emissions. And you see medium and heavy duty trucks making up 22%, and then aircraft making up 8% of those emissions. Ships and boats, much smaller at 3%. Okay. Now, one thing that's happened over time is that the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions from transportation have overtaken that from electricity. And that's in some ways a good news story, because the reason for it is that, as you can see, as we go from basically 2012 on, there's a big reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector. And that's because we are moving away from coal towards natural gas, which we know means lower carbon emissions. And so in some ways, it was easier for us to remove carbon emissions from the electricity sector because we were using a really dirty source, coal, and we could switch pretty cheaply to a relatively clean source like natural gas. And so you can see that it made for a really dramatic reduction in the carbon intensity, how much carbon is produced for a given amount of electricity of our system. That's gone way down. Transportation has remained stubbornly high. And so why is that? Well, that is because there aren't as many substitutes for petroleum-based fuels for vehicles. We've talked about how gasoline and diesel, they have just an incredible advantage in being energy dense. If in your car, it's just, that one little luggage sized container of gasoline can send you 500 miles. That's really amazing, and there's not anything to really compare with that. And so, there's a big challenge to building the kind of massive batteries that are needed to power electric vehicles or alternative vehicles. And so we can see that the greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector are kind of a more stubborn challenge, and we've had to try and find ways to reduce them. Now, how do we reduce them? Well, we actually have two standards that really work in tandem. One is under the Clean Air Act, Section 202 requires emission standards for new motor vehicles. And it also preempts state standards, with the exception of California can be given a waiver to adopt its own standards, which other states can adopt. And that has been a very controversial issue over time, whether California should be given a waiver to adopt its own stricter standards for new vehicles, because from the perspective of auto manufacturers, they say, hey, we can't have a different vehicle for every different state. We need to have a single federal standard, which is what Section 209 is supposed to accomplish. But California has been given a limited authority in some circumstances, including in the context of carbon dioxide, to have its own standards. Okay, the other parallel standards that we get adopted are under the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, and those are corporate average fuel economy standards. And so rather than focusing on the emissions of carbon dioxide, they focus on limiting fuel use. But because, as we said, fuel use inevitably results in carbon dioxide emissions, effectively these operate roughly in the same way by increasing the efficiency of the fleet, mandating increasing efficiency for new cars. Okay, here's a case that examines a specific regulation adopted by the federal government. So this is Center for Biological Diversity versus NHTSA, the National Highway and Transport Safety Administration, which administers the CAFE rule. So for 2005 to 2007, for light trucks, including SUVs, the NHTSA set the standard for the CAFE, remember, corporate average fuel economy, that says this manufacturer as a whole has to ensure that its vehicles get 21 to 22 miles per gallon. Now, the statute said that for cars, right, so sedans, what people used to buy, very few people buy anymore. I still have a sedan. Those they set standards at 27.5 miles per gallon. But if it's a car for off-highway operation and is four-wheel drive or is more than 6,000 pounds, then it can meet this lesser standards of just 22 miles per gallon. The court here says that NHTSA failed to consider the greenhouse gas benefits of a stronger rule. It should have thought about, well, doesn't this separate rule for these light trucks in some ways undercut the stronger standard that the statute sets for passenger vehicles? And wouldn't there have been more greenhouse gas benefits? Okay. Now, as you think about these standards, I want you to think about a couple of things. Like, one is, what is the point of these fuel efficiency standards, right? I mean, the ultimate goal is to reduce carbon emissions from vehicles. But you might think, is there a better way to achieve these goals? Because remember, these standards only apply to new vehicles. So this applied to light trucks sold in 2005 to 2007. All those old vehicles continue to be just as gas guzzling as they used to be. And in fact, some people have worried that, okay, couple problems. One is when we adopt this new standard, that might stop people from buying new, more efficient vehicles, and they'll continue to drive their old vehicles. It might be even worse than that, because let's say that this does reduce gasoline use. Well, then won't that just lower the price of gasoline? So those old gas guzzlers will say, hey, I'll drive an extra 10 miles. Instead, why do I even bother biking? I can take my car. It's cheap. And so there's a worry about what's called a rebound effect, which is the idea that by saving or reducing our use in one area, you actually get more use in another area. And one potential way to achieve both these goals would simply be to charge people for their use of gasoline. And we do have a gasoline tax, but we haven't raised it in a long time. And in fact, maybe it would make sense as a different way of addressing this, not just focused on new cars, but getting everybody to conserve gasoline to have a gas tax. Now that's what most economists have, traditionally favored. You can imagine that might be less popular. Maybe people are more willing to pay a little extra when they buy a new vehicle, as opposed to, paying more for the car. And maybe they don't have the money to go buy a new car, and so they're stuck paying that gas tax. And so, it may be for sort of political reasons that we've used this kind of suboptimal form of regulation to reduce emissions. I also want you to think about, what's the point of these different standards for different vehicles? And that is historically the way that these standards has worked, is that if you have a larger vehicle, we're generally going to set a lower standard, or we're going to set an easier to meet standard for you. In a certain sense, that makes sense, right? We expect larger vehicles will be less efficient. But remember, these are corporate average fuel economy standards. So effectively, manufacturers get to make the decision, are they going to sell bigger vehicles or smaller vehicles? And if you just had one standard for all of them, they would have an incentive to sell those smaller, more efficient vehicles. And so in some ways, the decision to separate and have different categories for bigger ones and smaller ones is to advantage bigger vehicles. Now, there may be, there's often sometimes political reasons for that, right? A lot of times American manufacturers have been better at making those bigger vehicles. And so if the administration were not to distinguish, that would actually benefit, manufacturers from Japan and otherwise who have more efficient vehicles being sold. So it's an interesting policy question, another area where maybe the regulation is a little bit suboptimal because we're thinking about political concerns. Okay. Now, it's important to understand that although vehicles are the bulk of our greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, there are other sources. And one in particular that has continued to rise is from air travel, which is just, as people get wealthier, they seem to want to travel more and more by air. And so I think, even people who expect our vehicle emissions to kind of level off a little bit, maybe we'll get better public transportation, maybe people, there just won't be, not as many people will have driver's license, etc. Those things are possible. But I think air emissions are expected to increase, particularly because we don't have battery airplanes. That's not really anytime in the foreseeable future, because their batteries just are less energy dense. They don't have the energy density of jet fuel that makes it possible to travel in the air. So I think, if we look forward 20 years, I think you might see that a lot more of our transport emissions come from air. Okay. Another way of looking at the same thing you can see here is that those emissions from different sources, whether they come from passenger cars, from light duty trucks, ships and boats, from rail. In the U.S., we often have diesel for rail, and then you can see aircraft. You can see that there aircraft, kind of has gone back and forth. So it's not, it's not 100% clear that it's going to be, that's going to be the dominant source moving forward. But I do think that as we expect, maybe there are not, continuing fast increase in light duty trucks and passenger cars, and you can see that they've actually gone down a fair bit, the greenhouse gas emissions from them. It may be that air is a more important source of greenhouse gas emissions. Finally, a couple more issues about the composition of the fleet and about electric vehicles. So first, composition of the fleet. One important thing that's happened, and this is why that light truck decision was so important, is that light trucks increasingly are the main kind of vehicle that's sold in the United States. Historically, it was mostly sedans were sold. But you can see by 2001, we got to about 50% light trucks. That went up to 60%. Then with very high oil prices in like the 2007, 2008, 2009, you saw a slight drop off as people moved back to more efficient sedans. But what's happened with cheaper oil prices that we've had since that time, so really since 2014, is we've seen a drastic run back to light duty vehicles. And it seems like moving forward, most people are going to want those light trucks rather than cars, and so it's really just not going to work to have standards that are mostly focused on vehicles like we had historically. Those light truck standards will be, if anything, more important. Okay. Now, on electric vehicles, it's important to understand, of course, the electric vehicle doesn't have any emissions coming from the vehicle itself. But of course, there is this question of, well, where does the electricity come from? And so, this is just a cartoon saying, obviously that electricity comes from somewhere. If it's coming from coal, maybe it's a substantially dirtier form of emissions. Now, there's a couple things I'd say about this. One, keep in mind that even if it was all from coal, that coal nowadays is often going to be located in places where we try not to have a big impact on urban air quality. Whereas the car, when it's emitting from that tailpipe, is emitting often in crowded urban centers. So there may be a local impact of that air pollution. Now, if you're talking about carbon dioxide, generally the carbon dioxide emissions that you're going to get from the electricity that goes into an electric vehicle are going to be much smaller than the emissions that you get from the gasoline being burned in the car directly. Now, this again, it's a group with its own point of view, but you can see that the Union of Concerned Scientists here is effectively saying that when you consider what power sources are provided on the grid in different parts of the country, in most places, driving an electric vehicle is like having a car that's getting 50 miles per gallon, or maybe at worst, like 38 miles per gallon. So it would be a very, very efficient vehicle. In some places, like New England, it's like having a car that's 100 miles per gallon. So yes, there are carbon emissions from the electricity that is used to charge a vehicle. But usually, and this is in part because of the efficiency of that electric engine, those vehicles are going to have lower greenhouse gas emissions tied to their operation overall, and they're not going to have any emissions from the tailpipe. So now, one important caveat is that one challenge is that a lot of the electric vehicles that are being sold are particularly giant electric vehicles. So, for instance, the president, as far as I'm aware, has only gotten in 2 electric vehicles. One is the Ford F-150. The other is the electric Hummer. The electric Hummer weighs almost twice as much as a regular Hummer. And another aspect of pollution that you get from vehicles is that they cause wear and tear on the roads and on their tires that leads to urban air pollution. And the bigger they are, the more pollution they cause. Now, that's becoming a more and more important source of emissions as we've lowered emissions from the tailpipe and as cars have gotten cleaner. So there is this kind of open question of how much harm is caused from these sort of giant electric vehicles that are being sold in terms of urban air pollution. The other thing to say is, of course, if electric vehicles are requiring not just a normal amount of electricity to travel like a normal vehicle, but they're requiring huge amounts of electricity to power a vehicle that's twice as big and can get 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds. That may mean that they have a bigger impact on carbon dioxide depending on where that electricity comes from. And so for that reason, you've seen even some people who are big electric vehicle advocates saying, okay, but we gotta get these smaller. Now, obviously that conflicts with the goals of people who want widespread adoption and want to attract Americans to buy more and more electric vehicles.